Now that was like, so one part of you would say that was insane that I did that, right? And
It would have been really
it was
insane.
very risky, but I felt like it was the only way I could get through it, was to feel
Wow.
powerful in my life so
Yeah.
that I could feel powerless in therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
But
a
it was
real...
really risky. It was very risky. Like now I think I probably shouldn't, like it's very good for my life that I did it, but it probably was, it was a risk. I mean, it worked.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Judy Rebick, feminist, social activist, broadcaster, public speaker, author. Known as a champion of the rights of women, minorities, and the working class, Judy has been an activist since the 1960s. After working with groups in the New Left in Canada in the 1970s, Judy became a member of the NDP Waffle Caucus. She was a leading figure in the choice movement of the 1980s, including becoming spokesperson for the Ontario Coalition for Abortion Clinics, supporting Henry Morgentaler when he opened his Toronto clinic. Judy worked for the Canadian Hearing Societies as their special projects director from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. She was president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, the largest feminist lobby group involving over 700 organizations from 1990 to 1993. From 1994 to the mid-2000s, Judy hosted several CBC TV programs and authored 6 books on a variety of political topics calling for change. She co-authored her first book, published in 1996, with Kike Roach, called Politically Speaking, and 10,000 Roses, Making of a Feminist Revolution in 2004. One of Judy's most important achievements was creating and publishing Rabble.ca, one of Canada's first online news sources and social media platforms, in 2001. In more recent years, she became the voice on the topic of mental health and depression. In 2018, Judy wrote and released her memoirs, Arrows in My Head, discussing her struggles with depression and dissociative identity disorder that heightened during her work in the 1980s and was a direct result of suppressed memory of sexual abuse as a child. Judy is currently teaching at Toronto Metropolitan University and project advisor for the Canadian Women Chambers of Commerce. She continues to protest for change.
There we go. This is your story. So it's about the personal and the professional. And if anybody has read your book, the deeply intimate autobiography, or listened to the audio book, which I've been listening to, they'll know the depths of your commitment and sometimes your despair. And there's so much to unpack, and it would take a series to review it all.
Right.
But we're going to try. We talked to others about their aha moment when they knew what would lie ahead and how they wanted to make a difference. So where and how do we start with Judy Rebick?
Well, I've been thinking about this because you told me you were going to ask, and I don't really think I had an aha moment. But the first moment I realized girls weren't treated like boys was when I was 13, because I had 2 brothers, right? And I was kind of feisty kid, right? More than my brother, my older brother for sure. And so, I didn't really think about it very much until I was 13, and then I was going to Hebrew school, but I wasn't allowed to have a bat mitzvah because there was no such thing.
Right.
Only boys had bar mitzvahs. And it really made me mad. because I was better at the Talmud than my brother. So why shouldn't I be able to have one? So I talked to my father about it. My father was a big fundraiser for the shul, like the main fundraiser. So he talked to the rabbi. He was very persuasive. And the rabbi said, okay, she can have a bat mitzvah. And me and two other girls. So that's the first time that I realized I had to fight for myself as a female. But then I went through a long process. Like at McGill, I was active. Everybody was active, in the 60s, but not so much on feminism. I wasn't that interested in feminism. I just thought I was different than other girls. I wrote about feminism in the McGill Daily, but I wasn't that into it myself. But then I think when I really truly became a feminist was when I traveled the world. And I saw how women were treated, particularly in the Middle East.
Yeah, that I really want to cover, because that's really important and really important today. But what I wanted to go back to was your time at McGill, because in your book, I mean, that's a really interesting period. It was insightful to that drug and that hippie culture.
The McGill years were, very exciting, right? Like I still have friends from that time. And we were on the Daily. So this is where I'm saying that it's not, the Daily was the center of radicalism at McGill. And at that time, like when I first started in the Daily, which was 65, the student council was conservative. There was still a women's council, right? Like they had just maybe 2 years before women could serve on the student council. They had their own council for women, right? And so the women's movement didn't really get going till the 70s. But the Daily had a woman editor, which I'd never seen, a woman leading a group that was mostly men. And so that was, I think, inspiring to me. And then I decided I wanted to be a journalist.
And then out of McGill was the famous, the birth control handbook.
Yeah. That was,
so that Donna Cherniak and her boyfriend at the time wrote that. And it not only was a publication from McGill University, but it went to every university. And I was growing up in the suburbs of Montreal. It filtered down to the high schools.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a real seminal moment in the reproductive rights issue.
Yeah, it was huge. But it didn't really come out of a women's movement, right? It came out of the student movement.
Yes.
Yeah, it came out. I don't even think Donna Cherniak would have considered herself a feminist at that time. And it was a mixed group. It wasn't women who put it out. It was women and men together. So, but it was huge. It was really, really important, right? Because you couldn't get information on birth control. Like it was, guys were all into free love, right? Like you sleep with anybody who wants you to, basically. But it was impossible to get birth control. I mean, there was like one doctor in every city that would prescribe birth control to a single woman, right? And you had to know who that was. Yeah. And then abortion was illegal still until 69. So I guess that was my first feminist act was a friend of mine asked me if I knew a doctor, and I didn't, but I found out. And then I started to be part of a kind of underground referral.
Which is also because if you take a look at a couple of years ago, Looking for Jane, the book by Heather Marshall, and she consulted you about, how to, in a time where there was no abortion, there had to be a network.
Right. Her book is interesting because her book really describes what happened in the States, not in Canada. Canada was quite different because we could, by the time the 60s, the late 60s, we could go to the States for abortion, right? So our underground networks were find the doctors here, but also take women to the States, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was the therapeutic abortion committees in the 70s. That was in the early 70s. You were at McGill for a while, and then you went on your 12-month journey.
No, I went to New York first. So New York was very important.
Okay. All right.
So I left Montreal because it was getting too crazy with my boyfriend, like really crazy. So I fled and I came to Toronto. I hated Toronto. It was such a one-horse town that really was so boring. And I just felt like I couldn't do what I wanted to do in Toronto. So I moved to New York because I was originally from New York and I could stay with my aunt, right? So I moved to New York, and New York was probably where I had the biggest connection to the 60s culture, right? But it was already this is 68. It was already starting to fall apart.
Okay.
So, I met the yuppies and, I went to the Fillmore East and saw these great rock bands. And I didn't go to Woodstock because everybody in the East Village thought it was all tourists, so it wouldn't be cool. Honest. Yeah.
Right.
So
how did that work out for you?
So, and it's also where I became a lot who I am, because New York was really dangerous then, especially for a woman alone. And in order to not, like, all the women I knew just never went out without a man, right? And I just didn't want to live like that, So I learned how to make a scene. Guys would harass me on the street. I mean, really harass me, like pull out their penis, and I would just make a scene. And the thing about New York, as opposed to Toronto, is in New York, nobody minds their own business. So if you start yelling in New York, everybody comes to help.
Yeah.
And that's what would happen.
And so not in Toronto.
No.
Toronto. How does it? I was from Montreal, so we had a view of Toronto.
Yeah. So I think probably my experience in New York made me tougher. A lot tougher than I'd been.
And more aware.
And more aware of things, and more aware of things and of the dangers. And finally I left because the woman upstairs from me, I heard her being shot and murdered. And my apartment was the way out if the guy didn't go down the staircase. So after that, I thought, okay, I can't live in this place. It's too dangerous. So
instead you go traveling to the Middle East.
Well, I went back to Toronto, but like I said, I hated Toronto, and I had money because I had a really good job. I was working at Columbia University when all this stuff was going on. So I was there. I had money, so I decided to go to Europe. And then once I was in Europe, I got into this hippie trail, Wikipedia calls it the hippie trail.
Mm-hmm.
And I was alone, as a woman traveling alone.
And you were young. You were about 20.
Yeah. I was alone, and I went with these two guys to Turkey, and then up to northern Turkey so we could take a boat down, through the Red Sea, which was really, really beautiful. But then we took a bus from there down to the train to get to Iran. And that's when I started to realize that I might be in some trouble, because the bus stopped and the bus driver decided to make an unscheduled stop because he was tired. And the men in that village, they'd never seen a Western woman, right? Like, it wasn't tourism like now. And I dressed very modestly because I knew that this was a problem. And they surrounded the bus and started pounding on the windows, and it was pretty terrifying.
You must have been just frightened out of your wits.
Yeah, I was pretty terrified. But as you'll know if you read my book, I was dissociative, right? So I didn't feel fear very much. And it wasn't that bad. But then I took a train to Afghanistan, and I had a stop in Mashhad, which is the religious city in eastern Iran. And it's stopped for the holy day, and I went for a walk, and I saw a group of people, so I went over to see what they were doing, and I guess they were praying or something like that. And this guy started throwing stones at me, and then other people, and I was stoned, like stone. That's kind of stuff. And I ran to my hotel, and the interesting thing was I was scared by that, but the worst thing was about a half an hour later, there's a knock on the door, and I open the door, and there's an older man with the young man who started the stoning on the ground, and he'd been beaten unconscious. And the older man said, "I'm very sorry, madam." Right? So they did that to punish him for stoning me, and seeing that was worse than being stoned.
So it was a violent time, a violent city.
And then I met this guy, and I hadn't had sex in a long time. Like, I'd, been pretty sexually free before this, but I had no desire for sex on this trip, like none. Even though I had to hang out with Western men a lot because that was the only way I could stay safe. But I never found anybody attractive. And so I thought, and I was starting to feel depressed when I was in Kabul. So I thought, well, maybe if I have sex, I'll feel better. So I usually am pretty good judge of character, but this guy was good looking. He was from, I can't remember, Washington State, something like that. And I went to bed with him and it wasn't good, And later that night, he tried to kill me.
Oh,
We were sitting around a fire and they were roasting a lamb over an open fire. And he got up. And so I didn't know what to do, if I should walk toward him or not. So I just stayed where I was, which is a lucky thing, because if I'd walked toward him, he would have hit me. And I hear something whiz past, and I look, and there's a knife embedded in a tree behind me. So if he had gotten away with the knife, I don't know if I would have been dead, but there's not that many great hospitals.
So you came back, and then you got involved in the youth movement.
Yeah. And that was, again, women leaders, right? Like
Yeah.
I heard about this group called Grassroots that was organizing in Toronto, and I went to the meeting, and a woman who's my closest friend now was chairing the meeting, and it was a mixed group, but women were leading, and that was very rare. So I think that's what first attracted.
So, and this was the years in
1970.
1970.
Yeah, 71. 71.
Okay.
70, I was traveling. 71.
Okay. Yeah.
And 72. And they were organizing at that point, young people were traveling. It was sort of part of the thing of being a youth. And there was this kind of moral panic about thousands of young people coming to Toronto from across the country. And so we thought we'd set up, we called it Wachia, Tent City for Transient Youth. Right?
Yeah.
Right. And I like the idea of women leading. So we did that. We organized, and it got to be a really big thing.
And this was like Opportunities for Youth?
That there was funding from Opportunities for Youth, yeah.
Which, by the way, Opportunities for Youth, that's how Cirque du Soleil started. They were
I didn't know
they were street performers in Quebec. And they had Opportunities for Youth funding. Wow. So you're taken to this.
It was amazing because it was like when we were at U of T, the first thing U of T, the student council invited us. So we were in front of Hard House.
Mm-hmm.
There's I don't know what to call it. Anyway, there's
a
green there. And we set up there, and we were kind of like the Occupy. It was a bit like Occupy. We had yoga classes, we had other kinds of classes, we had food, pretty good food, I guess, and singing and dancing and all that kind of stuff. So it was like the idea of a lot of the hippie idea was to create an alternate culture. Okay. So when the new left was kind of smashed in the States and divided and split apart and everybody was fighting, the hippies thought, the electoral system, the political system, it's too corrupt. We're going to create our own society the way we want to create it, right? That was the idea of the hippies, right? And it is like drugs, sex, and rock and roll, yes, but also the idea that we're going to have a more egalitarian. But of course, we hadn't dealt with patriarchy at all. So you had these organizations that mostly men ran and that had no idea how to do things differently at all, even though that was their vision. And so it all fell apart, right? Grassroots was different because it was an actual conflict with the state, and we had 21 people arrested, and we had to fight for it, right? So that was different. And in the end, the Queen's Park, they gave us the Mercer site, which is on King Street. It was the site of a jail, so it was very depressing. Right. And at that time, King and Dufferin was really far away, whereas at U of T, everybody came, right? Yeah. But there, nobody came but homeless people. That's who was there, right? And we didn't know anything about homeless people, right? So
and they have their own issues. They have their own.
And also, there's hardly any homeless people in Toronto. They're certainly not visible at that time because they had pretty good social programs, right? So like welfare, you could live on welfare, you could live on UI, right? So there weren't that many homeless people, but most of the people who were homeless then were people who were seriously disturbed, right? Couldn't function in any other way. And so once we set up the site, then we had problems like rape and stuff like that, So it turned into something a little ugly.
That must have been you're still a young woman, and that just must have had such a powerful impact on your life to see that kind of...
I'm not sure it did, actually, because I couldn't go because I was named in the injunction. And also there were neo-Nazis in Parkdale, and they were threatening us, and the cops thought it was a serious threat against me and my boyfriend, we were the spokespeople.
Yep.
So we had to go to Algonquin Park and escape because they thought they were going to kill us. So you said this should have a deep effect on me, but like I told you, I just got more and more dissociated. Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if it had a deep effect on me or not, but so after that, I did I created a project with, I think it was OFY, then Opportunities for Youth. Council of Canadians was first, and they changed it into Opportunities for Youth. And this is the father Trudeau. I mean, the son Trudeau learned from him a bit, but the father Trudeau thought, this huge youth radicalization will just give them money to do their thing, and they won't be a threat. And it kind of worked.
Yeah, well, I remember growing up, and there was another theater group. There was lots, there was coffee houses. There's, YMCAs would get money, and they would organize things for young people and keep them busy, or, keep them employed for the summer so they can have a few bucks, when they went back to school. So I remember those things as being really important.
Yeah. So we started a co-op for unemployed youth. And there was a guy, we had to have a researcher to do I can't remember what. And he was a Maoist. Okay. And he said to me, Judy, you want to serve the people, but the problem is you're a reformist. So I said, no, I'm not. I'm a revolutionary, because we all thought we were revolutionaries, right? And he said, no, you're a reformist. And so he took me to a CPCML meeting at Cecil Street. I even remember where it was. And they had a leader called Hardy L. Baines, who was really a great speaker. But I felt like I was at a Hitler Youth meeting, because whatever he said, they all went, yeah, like it was awful. So, but it got me interested in Marxism, right? So then I started to read Marxism and Marx and Marxists. And it was the only thing that made sense. That made sense of what I saw in my travels was Marx and Marxist writers. The only thing that made sense to me, because at that point, there weren't a lot of really strong critics writing about capitalism, right? And I could see that it was capitalism that was doing all this in some ways, right? I would think of it as the U.S., but U.S. interests, right?
Yeah, there are cases to be made or discussions to be had around feminism and the economy. And, if you want to create, different kinds of systems, this is what we have. We have capitalism, and you can't sort of like blow it up.
No, it's doing a good job of blowing itself up.
Yeah, well, you couldn't, no matter how hard you tried, but you tried.
Yeah.
You tried, and you took
I never tried to blow. I was
no, but you were trying to impact on the system to change a system
revolution. We thought we could have a revolution.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very idealistic. I was never in favor of violence at any time. Like, there was a group called Red Morning that I worked with from off and on. They were part of the grassroots group too. And they were into things like trashing Eaton's windows, breaking windows. I never agreed with that. And I never agreed with any violence. I did think ultimately when there's a revolutionary movement, it'll have to use violence to defeat the violence of the state. That I agreed with, but I never believed in violence.
So once you had moved into that field, and then you became active in the union movement, which is also where a lot of great feminists came out of the union movement. So things like maternity benefits or, maternity leave at all, equal pay, some of the discussions around violence against women or sexual harassment. Much later.
Yeah. So I worked in this factory, and at a certain point I got very ill, and then I got depressed. So all of this, like you say, all of this violence and struggle and putting myself out there and all of that, finally I collapsed. I mean, I guess that's the only way, because, because I was working chemical milling. So I was working with sulfuric acid baths and I had a reaction to the acid. So I got sick first. And I think I always say that the reason that I fell into the depression, although I think I was depressed off and on without knowing it, but a clinical depression where I couldn't get out of bed, right? A serious clinical depression, was because it was the only time I couldn't do what I wanted to do. My doctor ordered me to quit. Right.
But that's the way your body protects yourself.
That's right. My body protected me. Yeah.
That's what happens. So it was your physical problem,
physical,
and then
I got depressed,
and
that was a big turning point for me, because then I had to go into therapy, which I didn't believe in at all. I thought it was bullshit, but I was depressed in those days. Well, I realize now I'm hypersensitive to psychotropic drugs. So whatever antidepressant medication didn't work on me, it gave me hallucinations. So I couldn't take medication. So I had to go to a therapist because I couldn't get out of bed, So, that's how I got into therapy, was against my own better judgment.
You did so many really great things. You worked with the hearing impaired, which was really important. You worked with unions, the abortion movement. I really want to hear. That is such an incredible story. Aboriginal women, anti-racism, violence against women and children, the Charter of Rights. There is so much to unpack there. So let's talk about.
Yeah, it was chronological. The first thing was working with deaf people. I don't like the word hearing impaired. So with deaf people at the Canadian Hearing Society, because I got a job at the Canadian Hearing Society because somebody told me, I was working at City Hall and it was horrible. I always like to say this because, again, it reminds us of how long ago it was. But I was working to check on, in those days they had computers like we're in huge things and building. And you had to check that it wasn't making a mistake, you see. That was my job. It was so boring. And it was also a very dysfunctional City Hall. So I got this job at the Canadian Hearing Society as a secretary in the information services. And I realized that there was no information about Canada and deaf people. It was all American. So I wrote a book called Deafness to Silent, because I didn't have much to do, right? So I wrote a booklet, 39 pages, still in the library, called Deafness to Silent Epidemic. And my boss, who's an amazing guy, Dennis Morris, he was like, I never met anybody like him, because he was the executive director of a nonprofit agency that served disabled people, but he was willing to take incredible risks to support the people he was serving, which is very rare. Anyway, so he promoted me to director of information services when my boss left. And then he realized my ability to organize a fight, right? And we had a lot of fights.
But that's interesting, because now, and from my involvement in the women's movement when I was at Women and Gender Equality, it's all about the intersectionality. So if there's some, the feminist movement, if it's violence against women, then women that are racialized, or women that are, poor women, women that are disabled, whatever the problem is, it's exacerbated because of that intersectionality. So you came at it first.
Yeah, I knew first. Yeah, I was anti-racist before I was a feminist. I worked with disabled people as I was becoming a feminist.
So you were always that intersection, always under, which is really because they think it's a new concept.
Yeah, no, we were always into that.
Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah. And then Dr. Henry Morgentaler.
Yeah, well, the abortion thing was when I got better from my depression, because I had taken a leave from my Trotskyist group. See, I'm working at the Canadian Hearing Society, but my focus is on politics and the Trotskyist movement, right? So I had to take time off that because I was depressed. I couldn't do anything. And when I went back, I don't get into why, but I decided this is not for me anymore, and I quit. The next day, I went to a meeting of that turned out to be the founding meeting of the Ontario Coalition for Abortion. I wasn't really that interested in abortion. I mean, I had helped women get abortions in Montreal, but it was just something I did. It wasn't something that I was really into. And but I went, and it was what was happening in the city. And And I have a big mouth and I'm articulate. So somebody said, well, do you want to be on the coordinating committee? So I said, sure. And so I jumped right into the pro-choice struggle as soon as I could. And then I met Dr. Morgentaler because I was chairing the meeting that he came to speak. And yeah. And then.
And you said he was kind.
Yeah,
you liked him. You became friends.
I liked him a lot. And not just he was kind, but he was very heart-driven, which is very unusual in those days for anybody who was active in politics, but especially for a man. And he was very heart-driven guy. And so, like, at the end of that meeting, he said to me, Judy, would you like to be the spokesperson for the clinic? I like your energy. Like, who did that then, right? Like, nobody. It was just like he felt I would be a good spokesperson. Because Carolyn Egan and others were much more, they were working for birth control. They were organizing it. I was just the newcomer, right? But we figured the problem we had was that the media would just go to Morgentaler. We had to have a woman.
So they just needed somebody with a big mouth.
Yeah, well, it helped that I protected him from the guy who attacked him. But yeah, so we needed a woman with a big mouth. So I went to OCAC and we agreed that it was a good idea. And that's how and then when the clinic opened and the guy came at Morgentaler with the garden share, then I defended him and all that was on every television show in the front of every paper.
I think I remember.
Yeah, because it was, first of all, political violence very rare in Canada still to this day, which is a good thing about Canada.
Yeah, I remember when the Supreme Court. I remember when I remember when that decision, because I had 3 children at home and my aunt was visiting, and she was unmarried. She didn't have children, but she had taught a lot of students in her life, and she must have been in her mid-60s. I thought she was ancient. And she was absolutely so excited the night that the news came on and that the Supreme Court had overturned any of the decisions. And I was quite surprised at her reaction, because I thought,
we had huge support.
Yeah, I was surprised at, I understood it. Yeah. Like my generation absolutely applauded it, but somebody of her generation, somebody that age who had been a school teacher.
They knew what women suffered from unwanted pregnancy.
Yeah. And
it was more important for them.
Yeah. And she would say chilling things to me that would, I'm just saying, wow, really? But she was really quite excited. I mean, that really changed a lot of things.
Yeah.
And really embedded our policy. And then now when you take a look at what's going on in the United States, you're thinking, wow.
Yeah.
Where are the activists?
Well, the activists are there, but see, they made a big mistake, and we knew that. Like, we were very sophisticated. Like, if you, I'm writing a book now about tactics and organizing, and like OCAC was very sophisticated in the way we organized. So we realized from the beginning, and we even discussed it, that the American women made a mistake because they won it in the courts, and then they thought they'd won it. So they just relaxed about it, went on to other things. And in the meantime, the anti-choice, what we called then the anti-choice, the anti-abortion people, would start to organize and got stronger and stronger. So we didn't want that to happen. So we were conscious of that.
So what's the difference? So you kept going. So
we kept going, and 2, we went after them. We didn't ignore them. Right?
Got it.
We debated them. We went after them. We talked about them. Right? Because, they like to organize. They used to like to organize in the shadows, right? They don't want to be, because they know people won't like them. I mean, even the cops don't like them. Nobody likes them. So they're awful, like they throw ugly pictures in your face and all that. So, so we consciously, and some things we did were accidental. Like when the cops started following women who came to the clinic to try and get someone to testify against Morgentaler. We decided we needed an escort service, and they had done that with clinics in the States.
Yeah.
And we organized an escort service, and those women, many of them would never come to a demonstration. A lot of them were middle class, sort of, not left-wing women at all, but they believed in choice. And they became like a kind of cadre for our movement, right? Because they had a personal interest. They served the women directly, right? So there are things like that. And then when I knew we were going to win was that day that I think it was a reporter from CJD came to the clinic. I happened to be in the clinic that day and knocked on the door, and I answered, and he had 2 tape recorders going. And one tape recorder he played for me was a woman with an accent saying Dr. Morgentaler had forced her to have an abortion. And he had the other one playing to say, well, what do you say about that? Right. So I said, well, I don't know anything about that, but what I do know is Dr. Morgentaler has been doing had a clinic open in Montreal for however many years it was at that time, 5, 6 years. And there's never been a single complaint. So something's wrong here. Right?
Anti-racism, violence against you, the Charter of Rights.
Now we're getting into a whole other period.
Yes.
So the thing I should start with is, how the hell did I become president of NAC? Because NAC was, a pretty
National Action
Committee on the Status of Women.
NAC.
So NAC was a really amazing organization. It really was. So it was a coalition of groups that, like I say in my book, it had everybody from the from right, the Women's Committee of the Conservative Party, the Women's Committee of the Communist Party, everybody from
Catholic women,
the Catholic
women's institutes,
the women who are against, war, everybody was part of
Voice of Peace.
Yeah. Everybody was part of NAC. Okay.
700 groups.
Huge coalition. And it was also intergenerational. At that time, it was a generational difference that was the big difference, right? And so, I won't get into the founding of NAC because I wasn't there, but it was really women from the 3 parties that were leading NAC for the whole first period of time. So, it was just the Montreal Massacre had just happened.
Yes.
Okay, so the Montreal Massacre was a complete, huge turning point in the women's movement because, anti-violence had always been, when I became president of NAC, the most shocking thing to me was how many of the member groups of NAC were anti-violence groups, like rape crisis centers and shelters. And I'd never worked in violence against women, partly because I was protecting myself and didn't want to deal with my own issues, right? And I was surprised at that. But after the Montreal Massacre, then the issue of violence against women became central to the whole country, right?
This was a real huge shock to the country about the war against feminism.
Yeah, that's right. The war against women and the war against feminism, yeah. But we had a fight for that, okay, for that interpretation. Even though this guy said put the women over there and the men over there, said you're all a bunch of feminists, and then killed them, the media did not pick that up.
How could they not pick them up?
They did not. I'm telling you. The media, especially in Quebec, but even in English Canada, was trying to say it was just a crazy guy. He was abused by his father, just a crazy guy. And it wasn't until Francine Pelletier was a feminist and a journalist, and had a column in Le Devoir, and she got given a letter by somebody in the police department, the letter he wrote, in which he said, feminists have ruined my life, and, et cetera, that we were able to really turn it around and say, this is an extreme example of the violence women face every day, right? Yeah. And it really affected me, the Montreal Massacre. Like, it basically triggered me, so that I started to become aware of what I was facing myself, and I had been sexually abused as a child, and the memories started to come back, and so on and so forth. So for me personally, it was very important.
So this would be at the same time as you were going through your therapy and learning all about your different personalities?
It was just before that.
Just before that?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was one of the triggers.
It was a trigger for that.
Okay.
It triggered that.
Wow. So, but then you became the president of NAC at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time as I was censoring. Now that was like, so one part of you would say that was insane that I did that, right? And it
would have been really insane.
It was very risky, but I felt like it was the only way I could get through it, was to feel powerful in my life, so that I could feel powerless in therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
But
a
it was
real...
really risky. It was very risky. Like now I think I probably shouldn't, like it's very good for my life that I did it, but it was a risk. I mean, it worked. Because my therapist, like when the personalities started to come out, my therapist would say to them, you can't talk in public because you'll get Judy in trouble, right? Because they're all children, right? And their job is to protect me, right?
Yeah.
So it worked.
So what do you think some of your greatest achievements were throughout all of these actions and activities? And, there's such a list of things that you've done.
Well, the obvious one is legal abortion, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty major. And then the other thing is, I think that the anti-racist work that we did in NAC and after NAC, I think has been very, very important because we have, I think that was very important. It wasn't easy to do, and we made mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes because we didn't know what we were doing. This is why it really bugs me when, the criticism that the women's movement's so white. We're the first ones who challenged racism in our organization. Nobody did it before us. We did it first, right? In NAC. Nobody really did it before that.
But were you bringing on women's groups that were Black women's groups and racialized?
Yeah, both. We did both. Yeah. Like what we did was, like, I'd worked on employment equity, right? So I said, well, how do you get a voluntary organization? We only had like 3 staff. We didn't have a lot of staff. So how do you get a voluntary organization to become diverse? Because if you're hiring, you can hire people of color, which we did also.
What are your greatest disappointments of some of the campaigns?
Well, I was very disappointed in the disappearance of the Charlottetown Accord because for me, it really changed my thinking about democracy. I became a real advocate of participatory democracy. I've written 2 books about it. And so that was very disappointing because it was such an amazing experience for me. Like partly it was personal because I was like a leader of a party, right? And I really got a higher opinion of people, of ordinary citizens, and how sensible they are. And so that was really, I think that was the biggest disappointment of my political work.
But the referendum wasn't quite like what you had tried to pull together for the Charlottetown Accord.
No, we were opposing it. Yeah, we were opposing it. But still, people were so serious about it, like Mulroney sent, to his credit, right? He sent a copy of the Accord to every household.
Yes.
Right? And so everybody, and people really read it, and they come to meetings with it all marked up. And like for example, when I was in Winnipeg and I was going to Thunder Bay and my flight was delayed and it was 3 hours late, 3 hours late. Okay. And I was just getting there like an hour before the meeting. So people, and I knew the media would wait for me, but the room was full. People sat there for 2 hours waiting for me to come. That's how serious. And it was like a big room,
And this was like 1990?
92, 93. Yeah. My experience of it was, wow, like people, if we had a more participatory system, people would really get involved, and they're really quite sensible, And so asking really good questions and, all of that. So I think that was, not that I was surprised, like I knew I was, on the CBC and the National the night of the referendum. And as soon as I saw what the premiers were saying, I knew that it didn't matter that we won the referendum. It didn't matter because they're just going to do what they want to do anyway, right? And so I think that was really my biggest disappointment, even though as a person, it was probably my biggest achievement that I was being the leader of a party with almost no staff. Every night I have to, like, we didn't have social media, but we did have email.
Yep.
Right. So every night I would write questions, and because my executive members were debating cabinet ministers, right? So I'd always have questions and answers that I'd put out every night on the, on the computer. And, we had This is really funny. So there were cell phones then, but they were so expensive we couldn't afford to buy one. They were huge, and we had to rent a cell phone. Right? And I remember a journalist calling me, and I was in the back of a van. And he said, "What city are you in?" And I didn't know what city I was in. Like, I had to look out the window. Oh, okay, Main Street. I'm in Winnipeg. Right? So, like, yeah, it was an amazing personal experience, right? And really got me into thinking about participatory democracy. And yeah, and then the system was just so, I don't know, corrupt's not the right word because they didn't really benefit.
No,
from
it was
just so
no. It was so
unwilling
entrenched.
to change.
No, but it was so entrenched in the, it was so entrenched in the way they work. The whole political system is just entrenched, and a lot of us think that we can try to change it from the inside.
Yeah,
that's a lot. I think that's why a lot of people join political parties, and that's why I would encourage people to join political parties, because if you want change, to do it, so you need the people that are pushing you from the outside. But you need people on the inside to help make it happen. Yeah. It is really entrenched. Yeah. Judy, we were talking about your time at NAC and, participatory democracy, but all at this time, you were also going through your own personal challenges and your struggles and trying, discovering things about yourself that are pretty scary.
Yeah.
Really scary.
Yeah.
So on the outside, trying to do your work, and on the inside, just finding friends you didn't know you had.
Yes, I had what now is called dissociative identity disorder, and back then was called multiple personality disorder. So it's a form of dissociation. The way I describe it is, everybody knows that you can be going on a long trip and you lose time, right? You suddenly don't know, how did I get from here to there, right? That's dissociation. We all are capable of doing it, right? And dissociative identity disorder is an extreme form of dissociation where your brain creates other personalities, right? So in my case, my brain created other personalities to protect me from my father's abuse. So when my father started to abuse me, I would dissociate. So I have no memory. I have no memory of the abuse. They have the memory, the different personalities, right? So, yeah, and that I was really lucky that after my first therapist, this didn't come out in the first sessions of therapy, first 2 years. Although I did remember being sexually abused at the end of the first round of therapy. But this is how crazy I was. I thought, I'm not going to tell him because then I'll have to keep staying in therapy and I'm finished with therapy. So, anyway.
No, you weren't.
Oh, I wasn't. I was just getting going. And then one of the women I worked with in OCAC was a therapist, and I knew she'd worked with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So once I'd had the memories, I didn't remember who did it, but I just had memories of being abused. I went to her, and I was really, really lucky because she's one of the few people that really knew what she was doing about trauma and stuff back then. And now trauma, it's all we talk about, right? But then nobody talked about it, right? So, or knew about it for that matter, the impact of trauma on our psyche. So, yeah, I was really lucky. Her name was Marcia Wiener. She's gone now. And I did the therapy and discovered these different personalities at the same time as I was present.
So you were Heroes, the title, Heroes in My Head. What a great title. I mean, you talk about your life and everything, and you don't really talk about the heroes until, the second half of the book, where you go, oh my God, these people saved me. Yeah. They're my heroes. Yes, that's right. It's not.
Well, how the name came to me was that I was talking to a friend of mine who's a neurophysiologist, Donna Mergler, and I was telling her about, because, I didn't tell anybody about this. Anybody.
How could you?
Yeah.
Because they're not going to believe you. Yeah, they've seen the movie Sybil.
That's right. That's what they think of. Yeah. So I was telling her about this, and she said, oh my God, Judy, you have such a beautiful brain. Because she's a neurophysiologist, right? So she said, I always knew you had a beautiful brain, but this is amazing. She just saw it as such a creative solution to sexual abuse, right? You just bury it, but it's not buried because there's these people inside your head that are dealing with it, right? And so that's where the name Heroes in My Head came from, because
Wow.
everybody always says, oh, Judy Rebick, she's such a hero. She's so fearless. I talk about that now too, because I say I was fearless, but that's not a good thing. Like, I used it in a good way, but it's not a good thing to be fearless. Fear is an important emotion, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
because
Yes.
it tells you when
Yes.
there's
Yes.
danger.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
important, right?
Yes.
Not if you get paralyzed by it, as you have to deal with fear and deal with it. But I was fearless, but it's not a good thing. It's not something we want, is to be fearless. Because if you're fearless, likely it is you're shutting a lot of other things down too, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. What was your intention, or what was your goal about sharing it with other people? Like, because it really is personal, and it's not something you just told your friends or, people that you work with. You're telling the world that this was a problem.
Well, I thought, and I was wrong, I thought it would help people, because here I am, like most people have, even if they hate my guts, they see me as a strong person, right? And so,
Yes.
yeah, and also very effective, right? And yet I was what would be considered mentally ill, right? I had a serious mental health problem. Like, it might be diagnosed as psychotic even, right? So I wanted to show that, like, we talk now about autism, neuroatypical, being on a spectrum. Well, it's the same thing with mental health. It's a spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it gives, and mental problems or mental dysfunction can give you a lot of strength as well as a lot of weakness. Like, I think a lot of our political leaders suffer from dissociation. Otherwise, how could they do it, otherwise, right? And I've seen them, and some of them are, I think, sociopathic, some of them. I won't get into who, but, there's nothing there behind the eyes. But a lot of people with extraordinary talent, extraordinary ability, have serious mental health problems, and it gives them strength as well as weakness, right?
Yeah.
And so in my case, it gave me superpowers, because I was fearless. Being fearless is a superpower, right? Like,
yeah.
And I had superpowers.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's true of a lot of very talented people. So, you read Bruce Springsteen's biography, and he suffers chronic depression almost all the time, except when he's on stage, right? And being on stage, he can get out of his depression, which is why he's such a great performer, right?
Yeah. So
it's like, yeah, I think it's true for a lot of very talented people that they have serious mental health problems, right? And so now I can still do what I used to, I can't. I'm 78, I'm not going to confront a guy with a garden shears anymore, but I can still do a lot of the things I used to do.
But you've also compartmentalized a lot of the work that you do, because you're a really good organizer. You're a really good orator. You can write really well. So it's the creative, it's the analysis, it's the research, it's the organizing. And to be an organizer, you have to be very skilled to be a really good organizer and win campaigns and to mobilize people or to inspire people. So you would have compartmentalized a lot of this. So you're doing this, and your mental health is over here, and you'll deal with it when you get to it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that
right.
is one way of dealing with it.
Yeah, but the gifts that I have, like, for example, I don't even know how I do it, but I'll stand in front of an audience, like at a rally, and I don't even know what I'm going to say. It just comes out. And It's like I'm getting a message from the crowd. And I can still do that. I still do it. Right?
I still have to write speeches, which I have to do tonight.
Yeah. I never read a speech in my life. And in many rallies, I think a little bit about what I'm going to say, but I don't decide what I'm going to say until I'm on the stage.
Wow.
Because to me, a rally speech is a conversation with the group, with the audience.
Your presidency at NAC saw important legislative changes for women. How would you consider today's state of Canadian society and politics in comparison to what you were doing in NAC?
Well, I also think what's different is that social movements aren't playing as big a role. Now that's changing right now because we have a rise of radicalization right now, youth radicalization. Look what's happening in the States, right? So, and I think we could compare that to my generation. And I thought that 2 weeks after October 7th.
Yes,
I
yes,
saw
yes, yes,
that.
yes.
I saw that. I wrote a piece about it, that this is a rise of a whole generation is happening here, you know, and all over the world, much more so than it was all over the world before, right? It was
Yeah.
all over the Western world,
Yeah.
around Vietnam. It's all over the Western world, the rise of youth radicalization. Now it's all over the whole world, right? So in that sense, I'm very optimistic right now because I think that this rise of youth is going to have as much influence on the future as that rise of youth had, right?
If they get into the right issues, if they do more than it's just the current conflict in.
No, of course it has to be more.
But it has to be about either the economy
but once you
or
organize,
the
like who ever heard of the way they're organizing? Like there's been demonstrations every weekend for 6 months. I've never seen that, and there's been not one bit of violence.
Yeah.
Now G20.
Yes.
You had a whole group of people, all they wanted to do was break windows, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
We don't have that here. There's no violence. There's no anti-Semitism, whatever CJA says. I've been on every march. There's no anti-Semitism. I haven't seen it. And I used to see in the anti-Gulf War marches, there was anti-Semitism, not here. And then once you organize like they're organizing, you don't leave that.
No, they have to.
Something else.
Yes, but that's the point. They have to find something else. This can't be about this conflict alone now.
No,
they have
no,
to change it. If it's about housing or if it's about the affordability, it's whatever.
Well, this conflict has to resolve itself one way or another.
Yeah. So we're going to come to our end because I know I've run way out of time or overtime. Throughout your many advocacy roles, president, author, journalist, what is the main skill you've learned? And that is critical when trying to make an incite change. So what's the one thing that you're going
I'm a storyteller. Okay. I think that's what's in common. Also a teacher, right? I've been teaching for
And you're
20
still
years.
teaching.
Yeah.
You're still teaching.
So I think that I think about that because I've done all these things. What's the common thread is that I'm a storyteller. I'm a really good
I'd love to be in your class. And if you had to last question, if you had to talk to your younger self, what would be the shortcuts you would tell yourself? And would you do it all over again?
No, I wouldn't do it all over again. But
that's what I tell my daughter, learn from my shortcuts. I will tell you what the shortcuts are. What are the shortcuts?
I don't know. I mean, now I can say, and I did say, I just did a workshop on burnout. And I said, like, you got to take care of yourself, right? Like, we talk about self-care, but you can't just drive yourself into the ground. My friend Frizana Doctor talks about what she calls it internalized capitalism, like that you have to work until you drop. And that's the only excuse. Or the idea that how can I, people write now, how can I not keep working when I see what people in Gaza are suffering or people in Israel are suffering? Well, doesn't work like that, right? Like, sure, that's always been true and it always will be true that we suffer less than people in other countries who don't have as much material wealth as we have, right? But you have to take care of yourself.
Yep.
And you have to have support. And you have to, and that's been really the hardest lesson for me to learn. Even now, I find it hard to accept my limitations, like I'm old and I have limitations and I find it hard to accept. So I think that, but I don't think like that. Like, like if I had it all to do over again, for one thing, I would have dealt with my issues earlier.
But that's important. That's important to say to yourself.
Yeah.
Because I know what I'd do. I would be louder. I would be louder. I would do it faster. And I would do it louder. I'd be doing it a lot earlier. And I would have done more policy on top of the organizing. Like, because I would organize for other people. Whereas I think now I would like to be out there. I want to do a lot more policy. I want to be the person people go to. Yeah.
That's
so,
good.
so, you know,
Yeah,
so that's,
I don't. Part of it is like, you know, when I retired from from when I was full-time work, I thought I would be a full-time writer. I thought that's what I like, because I've been writing since a little girl. Like the one way I coped when I was little was to write stories, right? So, and I thought, okay, now I'm going to be a full-time writer, but that didn't happen because of the concussion, right? So it can't happen. I can't do that. So I am working on another book, but it's taken me forever because I have troubles concentrating, right?
yeah.
So I don't really think like that. Like, I don't think like, well, what should I have done, right? Because most of the time I didn't have that much of a choice, you know? I was sort of driven,
Yeah.
right? And given what happened to me when I was a kid, even though I'm very privileged in lots of ways, I think I did pretty well. You know?
You did very well. I think,
And, you know, the only thing is I'm not, you know, I'm single. I haven't had a relationship with a man. I mean, I'm heterosexual in, you know, I don't know, it's more than 20 years. Right. And so I wish I'd been healthier and that I could have had good relationships, which I wasn't able to have, you know? So, I mean, I have good friendships and that's important, but I wasn't able to have a real, I mean, I did have a real relationship. I shouldn't say that in case my ex hears the podcast, but, you know, it wasn't full because I didn't have the emotional capacity. So now I have the emotional capacity, but you know, I'm 78, right? So,
I know. That's like a whole other subject about our private lives. I mean, I've had lots of relationships and they're, you know, they've ended badly, mostly tragedy. And it's just, you know, so you just, you keep going, but you know, but the idea.
I said to somebody, you know, one advantage of being single is I don't have to make a Passover Seder, you know?
Well, the reason why I can do I have my day job, and the reason why I can do the Women's History Project is because all my children and grandchildren are far away and they're not in the same city. So I have the time to devote to whatever I need to devote to. Listen, I want to thank you very much. I think Canada is really lucky to have had you.
Thank you.
And I really think the women's movement is really, really lucky to have you. And I'm delighted that we've gotten through this 2 hours, I think, and just with great sense of humor and charm. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is my sense of humor that saved me,
Yeah.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.